Hey, so I'm talking today about my report on a dance personality, and I chose Agrippina Vaganova because my thesis is that she was the most important dance pedagogue of the 20th century, and I will explain why, and I will also explain my personal interest in her, as well as citing my sources and how I came to this conclusion. So this is actually my second recording of this video. I recorded one before. It was over 45 minutes long, and it did not upload to Canvas because I was offline for part of the time. I was not aware until I tried to upload it. So that's fun. Okay. So let's get right into it. So Agrippina Vaganova, most of the time, at least in the English-speaking world, when you hear Vaganova, they're referring to, sorry, I'm logging in my computer. They're referring to Vaganova technique or the Vaganova school. Now, there are 6 schools of ballet technique. Now, when I say ballet, I understand that that is equivalent of saying Western classical dance. I say ballet because it's easier, and also then like people know what you're talking about, and that the term ballet dancer is a redundant term. So there's the French technique, the Paris Opera ballet technique, which was the first. There's Giacchetti, which is the Italian. There's Vaganova, which is generally conflated with Russian technique, though there is some variance within Russia. There's the Royal technique, Royal ballet, which is the English. There's the Bourneville, which is the Danish. And then there's Balanchine, which is the American. But Vaganova technique comes from Agrippina Vaganova. She was a person, she was a dancer, and she wrote a book. This book, this is my copy. You can see it's well loved. I carry it around in my dance bag. But before she was a pedagogue, before she wrote her book, she was a dancer. And I'm going to go through her life. And this is not meant to be a narrative of her life, but I do have to talk about her life because it was so integral to her work and also to her influence on ballet, especially in the 20th century. So she was born in 1879 on June 27th. And her father was an usher. He worked at the Majinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. And so the Majinsky Ballet was the imperial ballet. It was founded by the Empress of Russia. And it was the personal property, let me move this a little bit, of the Tsar and the Tsarina. So right off the bat, you can see how her artistic inheritance was fundamentally imperialistic, and how Russian ballet was considered fundamentally imperialistic. And we will get to why that matters. So she doesn't come from a rich family. She doesn't come from an aristocratic family, but she does get into the Imperial Ballet School when she's 10 in 1899. I'm looking at my notes. And this is relevant because, as we know from our textbook, the first ballet company was founded by the King of France. And, ballet was based on court dancing. So from its inception, ballet is this very aristocratic, classist art form. But in Russia, it was, even under the Tsarist days, it was populist entertainment. The common person would go to the ballet, especially in St. Petersburg, the same way people now go to the movies, and people would write and read about what was happening at the ballet the same way that they, read and care about, what happens in the latest Marvel movie. And if you were a student of the ballet, then your room and board was paid for. So this was a way for poor children who didn't have access to, definitely to children who weren't aristocrats, but also just poor children who didn't have access to something like an apprenticeship or the personal connections to become an industrialist, because this was during the Industrial Revolution, to just make a living, or for families to not have to worry about having to pay for the care and the raising of another child. So she got into the ballet, and she was not considered a particularly talented student. She was not considered very pretty. She was not considered to have a particularly a body that was particularly well suited to ballet. She was considered very average, and nobody expected much from her. But she did go on to become a professional, and in 1897 she graduated from the Imperial Ballet School, and she did get into the Mijinsky Theater, the Imperial Ballet Theater, and she danced for a long time. She had a career of 14 years and was broken up. She didn't dance. She got married. She actually had a child out of wedlock, which was rather scandalous. But through her dancing, she met a man who fell in love with her and adopted her son. And by all accounts, it was a happy marriage. He was older, but by all accounts, he loved her very much, and it was a happy marriage. And she danced Oread the Nymph in The Trial of Demi, or Pranks of Love, and the role of the Black Pearl in The Pearl. Officially, she graduated in 1896, and she had to wait for a year because she was too young. So they had an age requirement before she could actually enter the Mijinsky Ballet. And there she danced for 14 years. For a long time, she just danced in the corps, and she eventually was, and I can't find documentation that she was promoted to soloist, but she must have been, because she was hailed by critics and fans, because she did have fans, as the Queen of Variations. And a variation was a solo that was designed to highlight certain aspects of technical excellence, like petit allegro or adagio. And she danced all of them. And in fact, she danced during while Petipa was working at the Nijinsky Theater, and I guess he did not like her. And she was known for her characteristic port-de-bras, which was exaggerated and integrated into all of her movements. And this would be relevant later in her technique, because she considered the port-de-bras and the arms to be just as important as the lower body in her technique. And she considered, like, you know, the whole body to be one line, as opposed to Cicchetti, who was working in Russia at this time. He, you know, most of his relevant pedagogical and choreographic work actually happened in Russia, even though he was Italian, who had more of an emphasis on segmenting the body into like a head, arms, torso, legs, and this allowed dancers to achieve the, you know, more acrobatic and showy, like very difficult jumps and point work, which is characteristic of Cicchetti technique. And so in 1910, she danced the waltz in Fulkin's Chopiana Nana. I hope I said that right. And in 1915, she danced Giselle for the first time. So she had a career in the Nijinsky Ballet for about 14 years before she was finally, which is a long time, especially back then, before she was able to be promoted to what I presume is the equivalent of soloist, and then finally ballerina. You know, she was, because ballerina is a title that is granted to a dancer by the company. And she was only a ballerina for 1 month before she retired. So she was not a great ballerina who had an illustrious career like, you know, Pavlova, or I can't remember the Italian ballerina who did fouettes for the first time. But she retired from performing in 1916. She did a farewell concert dance, The Source, The Best Traditions of the Past, and supposedly she lifted Russian choreography to new heights. So in 1917, the Russian Revolution happens. And this is a big deal because, you know, the Imperial Theater, it was imperial, like it was the personal property of the Tsar and the Tsarina. The Imperial Ballet in St. Petersburg, where she trained and worked, had been founded by the Empress of Russia. So, you know, she was very much entrenched in a thoroughly classist and aristocratic and royalistic conception of the ballet. And there were lots of Soviets, principally Lenin, who believed that the ballet was just, you know, another, it was like the Fabergé eggs that belonged to the Empress Alexandra, you know, that they just needed to be gotten rid of, and that Russia, or the Soviet Union, needed, I'm going to put this down a little bit, needed new art forms, and that a ballet was not relevant, you know, and that there was nothing that ballet could offer the Soviet Union, that they should just get rid of it. And so there were some, like, and also at this time, like, many dancers fled, you know, like Nijinsky and Diaghilev, you know, they were already performing outside of the country, and it was during this time that Nijinsky actually retired shortly thereafter. And like that's when, you know, people like Balanchine and Denivela, they left the country. They didn't think that they could have, and they didn't think that they could have a career, and they were probably right. As a dancer in the Soviet Union, they had to give up their country for their art. But Vaganova, for whatever reason, and like Soviets considered her a hero for this reason, that she stayed, and she believed, you know, no, ballet is a valid art form, just like music or, you know, visual art like painting or film. And this is, you know, about the time that Russia started the first cinematic school, because, you know, they wanted to create this art form to serve the Soviet Union, to serve the cause of communism. And actually, this is where I want to talk about one thing that, you know, ballet was one vein of a larger movement during the Cold War. There was a cultural movement of the Cold War, and ballet was very much a part of it. That this idea of, you know, new nationalistic identity forming in contradiction to each other. That, you know, like if the Soviet Union is going to create art that is emblematized by Soviet realism, then, you know, the United States is going to create art that they want to be equally as compelling and valid, that is the opposite, you know. And so this is, you know, like later, you know, when you get people like Jackson Pollock and John Cage and like the National Endowment for the Arts, and that's really how Balanchine was able to build his career. That you know, like we could create a ballet just as good as the Soviet Union that's going to be distinctly American. And the Soviet Union was trying to, through the influence of people like Vaganova, that is distinctly Soviet. And also, like, you know, I mentioned you know, the cinematic institute. So people like Eisenstein, like one of his producers got shot, and like Vaganova got arrested. You know, like, so to stand up for yourself as an artist in this climate was something that could get you killed. So it was, you know, like an act of incredible bravery. So in 1917, so the same year as the revolution, she begins her career as a dance pedagogue, which is what I'm doing my report on, because there's, you know, very little recording of her as a dancer or as a performer, and tragically little of her as a choreographer. Because, and I don't know about other places, but like in the English speaking world, when we talk about influential dance artists, we talk about performers. Sometimes we talk about choreographers. We less often talk about pedagogues, but it's, I think, more important. And so she worked for a time at a private institution, and then in 1921, she goes back to St. Petersburg, where she was born, where the once Imperial Ballet was, now the Nijinsky Ballet. And she starts working at the Leningrad Choreographic Institute, so formerly the Imperial Ballet School. And later it would become the Vaganova School. And then in 1922, she begins to teach the class of perfection at the State Academic Theater and Opera. So she starts working as a teacher, and then people start to realize, like, yes, we want to retain ballet as a form of popular entertainment, and we want it to be formed in a way that is conducive to socialist propaganda, basically. And so then she becomes the artistic director of the Kirov Ballet, which is once a position that was held by Petipa, who did not like her, that I find interesting. And, you know, particularly when you talk about port de bras, because like when you see, you know, like the pictures, you know, like the port de bras like changed, like the elbows were under, and there was more emphasis in Russian ballet on the character dancing. So like this pantomimed sign language that would tell the story to the audience, because there was no talking, because it was dance. So she works as the artistic director of the Kirov Ballet under her jurisdiction. She is following a guy who was more like, he would choreograph ballets that were more communist. They were more deconstructed. They were more just about the purity of the movement. They told stories about workers, about the working man. And they also started to employ more of what then was referred to as circus acts. And so what we would now call gymnastics or acrobatics, you know, flips and things like that. And she said, no, what we need to do is we need to bring back the classic ballets. And this brings me to another point, which is, you know, one of the reasons why I think she's so important, that she believed that she was like a link in a chain of like a cultural and artistic inheritance. And so she said, we need to bring back the ballets by people like Petipa. We need to bring back, you know, Don Quixote and the Nutcracker and Swan Lake. And I'm going to talk about Swan Lake. So she restaged Swan Lake, and she actually changed Petipa. And this is a performance I want to cite. So if you go on and you Google like the Mijinsky or the St. Petersburg or Kirov Ballet, and you look at the first, I'm saying the word a lot, the first pas de deux between Prince Siegfried and Odette, you know, the dance, like with all the amazing port de bras, because remember, she was known for her port de bras. She believed port de bras was just as important as your legs. Like originally that was pantomime. It was, you know, this kind of sign language, but she replaced it with like full on technical dancing. And she believed that, you know, like that had the artistic and emotional power to communicate what was necessary to the audience. And I find that just so compelling, because like, what would Swan Lake be without its port de bras? And I'm reading from one of my sources now. In 1933, she restages Swan Lake, attempting to preserve the value of the 1894 production and changing some of the dramatic expression by cutting the scenes she considered heavy in pantomime. Vaganova adds several variations and alters port de bras to create swan arms, as they are known today. On Vaganova's initiative, a pedagogical department is opened. Vaganova publishes her book. This one. Also, a national division opens to prepare special cadres from the Soviet Union republics for ballet theaters. So she really fought for this notion that ballet was an art in its own right that was just as valid as music or drama or visual art or film that could serve, you know, the Soviet Union or any ideology, because it's compelling to human beings. So in 1935, following the trend of socialist realism, Vaganova re-choreographs Esmeralda, which was an adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which has more realistic stage images than the previous version. The theater is renamed the Kirov, so the Kirov Ballet, after the recently assassinated Sergei Kirov, the mayor of Leningrad. And this is a moment when I want to really underscore the fact that, like, people did get executed. Like, some of Sergei Eisenstein's producers got executed for being enemies of the state. So, like, the stand that she took for her art form was very courageous. In 1936, she receives the title People's Artist of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. And in 1943, she becomes the consultant for the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. On June 19th, is awarded the title Professor of Choreography. So this is another thing I want to underscore, is that, like, when she started teaching, you know, she had her first student, I believe it was Semenova, who was one of her more influential students, becomes, you know, this very popular, very, like, undeniably brilliant ballet dancer. And, you know, people, because of course there was lots of infighting, just like there is now, and lots of politics, like, you know, artistic politics, personal politics, saying like, oh, well, she was just fortunate to have a talented student. But then, like, every one of her students became a virtuoso ballet dancer who also went on to become, you know, a strong artist and pedagogue in their own right. So Semenova, Moiseva, Plisinskaya, Ulanova, Dudinskaya, Kirilova, Shilist, Balabina, Vechitslova. And so these people, like, they went everywhere. They went to Paris. They went to the ABT. They went to the New York City Ballet. They went to the San Francisco Ballet. They went to the ballet in Chicago. They went to Milan, you know, and then, like, they started teaching. And so, like, this was when people started to realize, like, no, like, Vaganova is, like, creating a generation of great dancers and great ballet teachers and pedagogues and choreographers and, you know, like, people who are students of ballet technique. Because the thing about Vaganova is there's the six, I went over this, the six schools of ballet technique, and she really synthesized the French and the Italian, because of course the first, as we know from our textbook, the first school of ballet was in Paris. You know, it was very royalist. And it was very much, like, about storytelling. It was an alternative to theater. And then the Italian, you know, like, this is where ballet first came from, was court dancing. Like, under Cicchetti, he subscribed to the idea that to learn, you need to segment the body into, like, different parts, you know, the head, the arms, the torso, the legs. And that's how, and he had more of an emphasis on, like, athleticism and being able to do the big, difficult jumps, you know, and the, like, the tricks. And she really fused the two into ballet into, like, one technique. And then the other three techniques all owe, either through continuation or through antagonism, like working against, an artistic debt to her. So, like, in the 20th century, like, all roads lead back to Vaganova. And even today, the, you know, prima of the Bolshoi Theater, Svetlana Zarkova, she is 2 generations removed from being a direct student of Vaganova. So, like, you know, and then, like, you know, ballerinas from the Bolshoi were writing to her and saying, like, let me come to Leningrad and let me take classes from you. So, like, all over Russia, people knew, like, you should take classes from Vaganova. So in 1946, she received the Stalin Prize of the First Class for talented achievement in the area of the art of ballet. Later, Ulanova, Dudinskaya, Semenova, Vyacheslava, Babina, and Shilist also received the Stalin Prize. And I believe it was Semenova was Stalin's favorite dancer. High praise, considering that Stalin was terrible. But Semenova is also particularly important because, like, in the 30s and, like, after the First World War, like, people on the world stage, they knew about Russian ballet, but they knew of it through the Ballet Russe, which was working through Diaghilev and Nijinsky. They were working out of the Paris Opera Ballet. They were working out of France. And so there was this notion that since the Russian Revolution, Russian ballet had either stagnated or had started to die. But then Semenova came to Paris and she performed, and she was so perfect. And there's videos of her on YouTube that you can watch. And her technique is so perfect. Like, every turn, every jump that she does, like, starts from a perfect position and ends in a perfect position. And she never wobbles. And all of these Soviet ballerinas, like in the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s, people like Maximova, you watch them, and it's all the same. They're so strong. And it's because they had this very strong technique that was taught by Vaganova. And then in 1951, she died. So she wrote this book, and there's kind of a funny story. Like, during her lifetime, this book was published all over the world, and I guess she went to collect her check for the royalties for the English publications, and it was $8. So she did not get rich doing this. She did it for the love of her art. And this is the point in which I want to talk a little bit about my, like, personal connection to her and why I'm so interested in her. Because, like, I grew up dancing. My mom was a ballet teacher. She put me in ballet classes at a very young age. And I never really thought much about it. But then, like, now in the past couple of years, since, like, I've gone back to school and I've gone, like, no, like, this is what I want to do. I want to be an artist. I want to be a choreographer. I want to be a dancer. And so I picked up this book, and, like, I will read things out of here that, like, completely are, like, exactly what I feel in my body and exactly what I've been taught. But, like, no, I don't remember anybody ever sitting me down and telling me this. This is just, like, what I've learned through the technique. Like, for example, the one that, like, really blew my mind is in her book on page 136, when she's talking about Grand Battement. And she says, I consider these exercises to develop the muscles and tendons, and think that artificial, unnatural ways of stretching, which are practiced sometimes at the bar, such as putting your leg up on the bar, which I do all the time, or in the center, are superfluous. I highly recommend the described exercises. The following method can also be of assistance. Face the bar in first position, legs fully extended, hold onto the bar with both hands, pull to the right without lifting the heels off of the floor, return to the initial position, pull to the left, repeat several times. And that's exactly what I was taught, how to stretch my Achilles tendons at the bar at the beginning of class. And, because she, wasn't considered a particularly gifted student, like, everything she achieved through her intuitive understanding of human anatomy and of technique. And she understood things like progressive overload, that, like, she says in her book that, like, you should do the same bar for at least 3 months without changing it. She says, there is nothing bad about exercises being tedious in their monotony, although this monotony can be broken by doing movements at different time, 4-4-2-4, so that the pupils do not do them mechanically but to follow the music. In these classes, a foundation is laid for the development of muscles, the elasticity of ligaments. The basis is instilled for the elementary movements. All of this is accomplished through systematic repetitions of the same movement a great number of times in succession. And she also, and in the documentary that I'll cite at the end, like her students talk about how she didn't want everybody to look the same. She understood that the technique works on human bodies, but it works on all different kinds of human bodies. And she wanted people to use the technique to create their own artistic expression. And then similar down the same page, this is all on page 15. In a word, if we, okay, no, wait. Sorry. Oh, I cannot give a rigid plan for the construction of lessons. This is the realm where the decisive part is played by the experience and sensibility of the teachers. It requires absolute individualization. And then later, when she's talking about pliés, she says, people who are naturally endowed with a talent for the dance have a very pliant Achilles tendon. The leg easily forms an acute angle on the foot. Others have an Achilles tendon that bends with great difficulty. In such cases, it is necessary to begin a struggle with nature, and here we must exercise great caution and consideration. Therefore, if the feet of the pupil who finds it hard to plie should begin to hurt, especially the ligaments, it is best to refrain for a time from beginning to work on her plie and return to this later and do it gradually and carefully. So she understood that ballet bodies were made, not born. And that's, I mean, I assume part of the reason why she wrote this book, which like really, she doesn't, like there is no like, you know, singular performance I can cite. Like the work of hers that I cite as significant or a masterpiece is this book that she wrote. And I also want to point out a couple things that I figured out in my research, which is that my, besides my mom, my preliminary teacher was Sidna Flynn with the Gilbert Reed Ballet. And I remember her classes very vividly. And I was very young. I was like 5, 6, 7. And she was taught at the San Francisco Ballet, and the San Francisco Ballet was founded by and employed teachers from the Mijinsky Theater. And my mother's teacher, Oleg Tupine, and his wife, who in this book, this is a memoir of Danivola, who was another significant expatriated Russian dancer. Here's a picture of him. This is Oleg Tupine. You can see how beautiful he was. So his wife, because he was, when my mom was learning there at what was once the Virginia Ballet, her teacher was Propinjinska, and she was a Vaganova dancer. And funny fact, when you Google Olga Propinjinska, the first result on Google results is the San Luis Obispo Ballet, which was founded as the Gilbert Reed Ballet, which is where I took from Sidna Flynn. I have no idea what the connection is, but apparently Google does, which is so weird. And all of this is very dense. And so I'll talk a little bit about my sources now, because this was frustrating, because there's a lot of stuff about like Vaganova technique and like what people have to say about Vaganova technique. But when you try to, or at least when I tried to find out more about her life and about how she came to these conclusions about, you know, her pedagogy, there's not, there's frustratingly little to an English speaker. Like, the sources are often in Russian. There was a source I clicked on at the bottom of the Wikipedia page about her that just wanted to sell me online lottery tickets. But I did find this book. Oh, there was one more quote I wanted to read you out of this book, when she's talking about how she when I was saying how she understood that she was only going to chain, and about how ballet was, an elementary art form that could be used for, the purposes of any human art form. She says, between the conventionality of classical dance and the demands of realism, there is no contradiction. We only need to understand this classical dance as movement that is socially and emotionally sensible, bringing into existence, building upon the actions and movements of an artistic image. Thus, it is approved through meaningful, realist-motivated, emotionally saturated dance. It is confirmed and created in our wonderful country. Nowhere else in the world are such conditions for the growth and flourishing of genuine artistic talents created. Now, I would argue it could happen other places, but you can really see how she believed in her art form as a valid art form to, be relevant to people, even in a new country that was trying to find its identity. So I did find this book, Vaganova Today, and by Catherine Pollock. And this is interesting because there's lots of interviews and also journal entries and letters from Vaganova that she was the first person to translate them into English. And this was only written in 2011. I believe it was either 2011 or 2012. 2011. So the other thing I want to say about the ballet schools is that I mentioned how there's Vaganova technique, which merged the French and the Jacquetti, and then there's the Bourneville, which is the Danish, which was Bourneville was working in Russia at the same time that Vaganova was dancing, and he was trained in the Paris Opera Ballet. The Royal Academy was founded by a woman who was trained by a Vaganova dancer. Balanchine was a Vaganova dancer. And also in the 80s, Nureyev revivified the Paris Opera Ballet as a, as its own form of instructional study ballet. But of course, Nureyev was a Vaganova trained dancer. So in the 20th century, all roads lead back to Vaganova. And I think that, as much as we kind of want to get away from it because it seems old fashioned and boring, I think this book and I think Vaganova technique still has much to teach us. And so that's why I'm going to keep it in my dance bag. So besides that, and besides the book by Catherine Pollock, I have a couple other sources. I want to talk about this one. It's the memoir of Danivola. There's the textbook, which honestly I didn't do much because it barely mentions Vaganova. Because as I said, there's just not tons and tons of information that I found readily available. There's the classic text. But honestly, I find this book to just be a watered down version of this. Also, if you go online, there is the Vaganova Academy website, and there's a documentary in Russian that I used a lot, and I Googled a lot of the people who were talking, people a very elderly Semenova, which is fascinating. And also, when I talk about art history, my main source is a art history professor named Amanda Halle. She's actually most famous for being a fashion historian, but her PhD is in art history, and she's also an expert in just cultural history of the 20th century. And you can watch her lectures on art history, which is where I got my information, in their abbreviated form on YouTube. But also if you go onto her page on Vimeo, which she actually sent me a link to because I talked to her online because she's nice and amazing. Then you can watch them in their entirety, and I find them very interesting. So I could easily have spent an entire semester just researching this topic. It is dense and it is broad, but I find it very exciting because I feel like there's still a lot to learn. And as I said, I still feel like it's very relevant. Relevant. I'm tired. Sorry. Did I mention this is the 2.5 time I've recorded this video? So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I highly recommend you check out Amanda Hallay, Hallay. All right. Have a good one.